The light in Rome has a particular quality in the early years of the 20th century. It falls gently on the terracotta rooftops and seeps into narrow cobbled alleys with a soft, amber warmth. In a modest apartment not far from the Termini railway station, a child named Enrico Fermi opened his eyes to this light in the autumn of 1901. The home was small, but filled with the quiet order of a railway administrator and a schoolteacher. From the window, young Enrico could see the sky shift from pale blue to deep gold as the sun dipped behind the domes and bell towers of the Eternal City. The sounds of the street below, a vendor calling out, the clatter of horse hoofs, the distant bells of Santa Maria Maggiore, blended into the peaceful hum of daily life. Enrico was not a loud child. He would stand for long moments at the window, watching the play of shadows on the walls of the building opposite. His mother, Ida, noticed his stillness, the way he could lose himself in a shaft of afternoon light or the intricate pattern of a floor tile. The family was not wealthy, but they shared a deep affection. When Enrico's older brother Giulio died suddenly, the household became quieter still. In the hush of grief, the younger boy found solace in books. One of them, an old Latin text on mathematics, fell into his hands from a market stall, its pages smelling of dust and age, its diagrams of triangles and circles like delicate spider webs etched in black ink. He devoured that book in the slanted light of his small bedroom. The world of numbers and geometry opened up to him like a secret garden. By the age of 10, he had already taught himself more mathematics than most adults knew. The cramped piazzas and ancient ruins of Rome became his walking classroom. He would wander past the Colosseum, not yet understanding the physics of its arches, but feeling the weight of centuries in the sun-warmed stone. The fountains in the piazza splashed softly, and Enrico would sit on the edge, tracing invisible equations in the air with a stick. Passers-by saw only a small, serious boy dressed in a neat but threadbare coat, his mind far away among numbers and stars. His father's colleague at the railways, a man named Adolfo Amadei, recognized the spark in the boy's questions. Amadei lent him more textbooks, algebra, trigonometry, even a treatise on theoretical mechanics. Enrico absorbed them as the dry earth of the Roman countryside absorbs spring rain. There was no struggle, only a quiet and steady unfolding. In the evenings, after a simple supper of bread and minestrone, he would sit by the oil lamp, the flame casting a warm golden circle on the page. His mother would sew nearby, and the only sounds were the scratch of a pen, the tick of a clock, and the distant echo of a street musician's mandolin. The Rome of Fermi's childhood was a city of layers, ancient, medieval, Renaissance, all bathed in the same golden light. On Sundays, the family might walk to the Gianicolo Hill, where the view stretched over a sea of roofs to the dome of St. Peter's. Enrico would stand very still, looking out, but he was not seeing the panorama. He was pondering a problem from his latest book, his mind moving through geometric proofs as effortlessly as the swallows swooped over the treetops. The breeze carried the scent of pine and cypress, and the sun warmed his face. It was a time of quiet growth, like a seed germinating deep underground, unseen but full of purpose. There is a story of the young Fermi building small electric motors from spare parts he found in the local market. In a dusty corner of the apartment, surrounded by coils of wire and scraps of metal, he created tiny machines that hummed to life. The thrill was not in the noise, there was hardly any, but in the understanding of invisible forces made visible. He would watch the rotor spin and feel a kinship with the natural world, a sense that its secrets were not locked away but waiting to be read by patient eyes. The light from the window would catch the spinning metal, casting dancing reflections on the plaster wall. In the year 1918, Enrico finished his schooling at the top of his class. His teachers, recognizing an extraordinary mind, encouraged him to apply to the prestigious Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. The night before his departure, he stood once more at the window of his room. The moon was high, silvering the rooftops, and the city lay quiet beneath it. He was 17 years old, and the future stretched before him like the Roman streets at dawn, calm, luminous, full of gentle promise. He would carry this light with him, the light of his childhood, into all the years to come. The train to Pisa carried Enrico through the rolling hills of Tuscany, past fields of sunflowers and olive groves shimmering in the early autumn light. When he stepped onto the platform, the air smelled different, a mix of river water, old stone, and the fresh promise of a new chapter. The city was quiet compared to Rome, its streets narrower, its rhythms slower. Here the leaning tower stood like a gentle punctuation mark against the sky, not yet the icon it would become, but already a curiosity. Enrico did not come to admire the tower, however. He came to enter the Scuola Normale Superiore, a palace of pale marble and high windows where knowledge was revered like a quiet prayer. The entrance exam was a moment of quiet intensity. Fermi wrote an essay on the characteristics of sound, a topic that required not just mathematical skill, but a deep intuition for the physical world. The elderly examiner, a man accustomed to polished performances, read the paper with growing astonishment. He called the young candidate to interview, not to question him, but simply to confirm that such a mind could inhabit a 17-year-old body. Walking through the corridors afterward, Enrico's footsteps echoed on the marble floors, the sound bouncing off frescoed ceilings, depicting scenes of ancient wisdom. The school was a sanctuary from the noise of the world, and he felt at home. His dormitory room overlooked a courtyard where a single plane tree cast dappled shade. The room itself was monastic in its simplicity, an iron bed, a wooden desk, a shelf for books. Each morning, the sun would slant through the tall window, illuminating motes of dust that danced above his papers. Here Fermi submerged himself in quantum theory, a fledgling field that crackled with unanswered questions. The books were often in German or English, languages he had taught himself with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. He would sit cross-legged on his bed, a volume of Planck or Einstein open before him, and the hours would slip by like water in the Arno. The Pisa of the early 1920s was a town where students and townsfolk lived in easy proximity. In the late afternoons, Enrico would walk along the banks of the Arno River. The water moved slowly, reflecting the ochre and cream facades of the palazzi. Gently arched bridges cast their perfect reflections, creating circles of stone and light. He often walked with fellow students, discussing not physics but poetry, music, the simple beauty of the Tuscan landscape. His laugh was rare but genuine, a low chuckle that blended with the sound of the river and the distant chime of church bells. He was learning that science does not exist apart from life, that the deepest truths are often glimpsed in the patterns of water flowing under a bridge. Inside the university library, Fermi discovered an entire cosmography. The reading room was a vast space with high-vaulted ceilings and long oak tables polished by generations of elbows. The light entered through tall arched windows, filtered by thin linen curtains that softened the afternoon glare. He would sit at the same table every day, spreading his notebooks around him like a cartographer charting unknown territories. The only sounds were the rustle of pages, the scratch of nibs, and the occasional creak of a chair. In this monastic quiet, he taught himself tensor calculus, the mathematical language of relativity. He was not just learning, he was preparing the tools for a future he could only dimly sense. During those years, Fermi also became a teacher to his own peers. A small group of students would gather in his room in the evenings, the single light bulb dangling from the ceiling creating a pool of yellow light. They sat on the floor or on the edge of the bed, and Enrico would explain the new physics, quantum leaps, wave-particle duality, the strange and beautiful weirdness of the subatomic world. He used no notes. The ideas flowed from him with a clarity that left his friends silent with admiration. Outside the window, the courtyard lay in deep indigo shadow, the plane tree a dark silhouette against the stars. It was a scene of quiet mentorship, the passing of a torch from one calm hand to many. After earning his doctorate in 1922 with a thesis on X-rays, Fermi lingered in Pisa for a short while. He walked one last time over the Ponte di Mezzo, the central bridge, as the setting sun turned the river into a ribbon of gold. The tower leaned gently in the distance, and the sky was awash of pink and lavender. He thought of Rome, of his family, and of the unknown laboratories that awaited him. The years in Pisa had shaped him not only as a physicist, but as a man, patient, deeply thoughtful, and illuminated by an inner light that required no spotlight. He boarded the train back south, carrying a suitcase of books and a mind ablaze with quiet fire. The Via Panisperna winds through the heart of Rome like a thread of memory. In the mid-1920s, at number 89, an old Institute of Physics stood behind a nondescript wooden door. The building was unremarkable from the outside, its stucco facade the color of faded mustard, but inside it buzzed with a new kind of energy. This was the Royal Institute of Physics, and Enrico Fermi had come home. The moment he stepped into the courtyard, a rectangle of pale sunlight surrounded by porticos, he knew this would be his laboratory for the next decade. The stone fountain in the center babbled softly, and potted geraniums added splashes of crimson against the old brick. It was an unlikely crucible for a revolution. Fermi was barely 25 when he was appointed professor. The other professors, older men with magnificent white mustaches and formal manners, regarded the boyish newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. But Francesco Severi, the mathematician, saw in Fermi a kindred spirit. They would walk together through the cloistered corridors, past laboratories filled with brass instruments and glass beakers, discussing the mysteries of the atom. The light filtered through frosted windows, casting a diffused glow that softened every edge. Fermi's voice was always low and even, never rising, but his words carried the weight of absolute clarity. Slowly, he gathered around him a group of brilliant young students, Emilio Segri, Edoardo Amaldi, Franco Rossetti, and later Bruno Pontecorvo. They became known as the Via Panisperna Boys. Their working methods were unconventional. Instead of stiff lectures, Fermi led them on long walks through the Roman Forum or along the Tiber. The boys would argue and laugh, their voices echoing off ancient marble ruins. The sun would warm their backs as they discussed neutron scattering and nuclear transformations. Back at the Institute, they worked late into the night in a cluttered laboratory on the second floor. The benches were a jumble of wires, vacuum tubes, and homemade counters. The air smelled of ozone and solder. Rossetti, a keen naturalist, sometimes kept a cage of butterflies on the windowsill, their colored wings a gentle reminder of nature's beauty amidst the circuits. There was no hierarchy, only a shared, joyful pursuit of the unknown. One of the most important chapters in this sunlit story began in 1934, when Fermi turned his attention to an extraordinary new tool, the neutron. Irene Curie and Frederick Joliot had just discovered artificial radioactivity, bombarding elements with alpha particles. Fermi, always an innovator, realized that neutrons, uncharged particles, might be even more effective. The laboratory had a small radon source, and the boys built their own neutron source by mixing radon gas with beryllium powder in a glass tube. The contraption glowed faintly in the darkened lab, a tiny star held in the palm of their hands. When they directed these neutrons at various elements, the results were astounding. Element after element became radioactive, transmuting before their eyes. The famous goldfish fountain experiment captured the essence of the Via Panisperna spirit. One afternoon, as they were bombarding silver with neutrons, the team noticed something peculiar. The induced radioactivity changed depending on where the experiment was conducted, on a wooden table, on a marble slab, or near the water fountain in the courtyard. Fermi, with his characteristic intuition, guessed that slowing the neutrons down might increase their effectiveness. They carried the equipment out into the courtyard. The sun was high, and the fountain's water sparkled. They carefully placed the source and a silver target underwater. The counter clicked faster. The neutrons, slowed by the hydrogen in the water, became far more efficient. This discovery of slow neutrons would later earn Fermi the Nobel Prize. That moment in the courtyard, with water splashing softly and the Roman sky overhead, was one of pure, serene discovery. The daily life of the group was woven into the fabric of Rome. At midday, they would walk to a small trattoria near the Trevi fountain for a simple lunch of pasta and fresh bread. The fountain's water played endlessly, a cool presence in the heat. At sunset, they might climb the Spanish Steps, watching the city below turn from gold to dusky blue. Fermi rarely spoke of his private dreams, but his colleagues sensed the depth of his ambition, not for fame, but for understanding. Late one evening, alone in the laboratory, he stared at a counter ticking away, its clicks like a quiet heartbeat. The numbers on his notepad hinted at a process with the power to unlock the energy inside the nucleus. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the threshold of the atomic age. Outside, the bells of Santa Maria Maggiore tolled peacefully, marking the hours as they had for centuries. By the late 1930s, shadows were gathering over Europe. The fascist regime tightened its grip on Italy, and racial laws were introduced. Several of Fermi's closest collaborators, including Segre, were Jewish. The once carefree walks along the Tiber now carried an undertone of anxiety. The courtyard fountain still bubbled, but the faces around it grew pensive. Fermi himself was not political, but his wife Laura was Jewish, and the new laws threatened his family directly. The Boys of Via Panisperna began to scatter, some staying, some leaving. The laboratory, once a haven of light, felt the encroaching chill. It was time for Fermi to look beyond the Alps, across the Atlantic, toward a new world where science might still be free. The news came in November of 1938, a telegram delivered to the Fermi apartment in a quiet Roman street. Enrico had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on slow neutrons and the resulting new elements. The family received the news with a mixture of joy and careful planning. To the outside world, it was a celebration of Italian genius. Inside the household, it was a ticket to freedom. Laura and the children began to pack their belongings quietly, choosing only what could fit into a few suitcases. The apartment, filled with the soft morning light through lace curtains, had been their sanctuary. Now it would become a memory. The prize ceremony was to be held in Stockholm, and after that, they would not return to Mussolini's Italy. The journey north was a slow, cold passage through a Europe teetering on the edge of war. The train wound through the snow-covered Alps, the peaks standing like silent sentinels. Fermi watched the landscape slip by, small villages with smoke curling from chimneys, frozen lakes reflecting the pale winter sun, forests of dark pine dusted with white. The compartment was warm, but the world outside looked deeply still, a monochrome painting of quiet beauty. The children slept, their heads resting on Laura's lap. Enrico sat with a notebook open, but his pen was still. He was not calculating now. He was dreaming of a new life where he could work without fear, where his wife and children would be safe. Stockholm at Christmas time was a city of soft lights and gentle snowfalls. The ceremony itself was a study in dignity, the concert hall bathed in warm gold, the king presenting the medal, the polite applause. Fermi gave his address in a calm, measured voice, thanking those who had helped him along the path. The audience saw a modest man in a formal suit, his hair already beginning to recede, his eyes serious but kind. Outside afterwards, the snow fell in large, lazy flakes, muffling the sounds of the city. They walked along the quays, watching the ice form at the edges of the water. The street lamps glowed, each one a tiny island of light in the deepening dusk. From Stockholm, the family boarded a ship bound for New York. The crossing in late December was rough, the gray Atlantic heaving beneath a sky of heavy clouds. But as they approached the American coast, the weather cleared. One morning, Fermi came on deck at dawn and saw the Statue of Liberty rising from a golden mist, her torch catching the first rays of the sun. It was a moment of profound stillness. Other passengers were still below, and the deck was nearly empty. He stood alone at the railing, the cold wind stinging his cheeks, and watched the skyline of Manhattan slowly materialize, a silhouette of towers yet untouched by the future he would help shape. The ferry ride to the immigration station was quiet, the water lapping against the hull. New York received them with the noisy vitality of a city that never stood still, but Fermi sought out the quieter corners. They found a temporary home in a residential neighborhood near Columbia University, where the streets were lined with brownstone houses and bare winter trees. His office at Columbia was in the physics building, a solid brick structure with tall windows overlooking a quadrangle. The laboratories were well-funded and humming with new ideas. Just before Christmas, Fermi arrived at the Pupin Physics Laboratories, carrying nothing but a briefcase and a mind full of plans. The news from Europe was grim. Hahn and Stresemann had discovered fission in Germany, splitting the uranium atom, and it sent a ripple through the scientific community. Fermi understood immediately what this meant. In those first weeks of 1939, New York was cold but bright. The snow lay clean on the quadrangle, and the sun cast sharp blue shadows. Fermi and a small group of colleagues gathered in an auditorium to discuss the implications of fission. Sitting in the wooden seats, with diagrams chalked on the blackboard, they realized that a chain reaction might be possible. If neutrons released in one fission could trigger another, a self-sustaining process might release enormous energy. The conversations were low and urgent but not frantic. This was science in its purest form, a puzzle to be solved with patience. Fermi would walk home through the quiet streets after midnight, his breath fogging in the icy air, the city sleeping under a blanket of snow. The peaceful silence allowed his mind to settle on the problems ahead. As spring arrived, Manhattan softened. The trees in Riverside Park put out pale green leaves, and the Hudson sparkled in the afternoon light. Fermi became a familiar figure on the walking paths, often deep in conversation with fellow refugee scientists like Leo Szilard, who shared his vision of a controlled chain reaction. They would pause on a bench overlooking the river, watching the ferry boats cut slow arcs across the water. The whole world was plunging into darkness, but here in this park, there was a sense of calm purpose. The physicists were not building a weapon yet. They were building an understanding, a steady flame of knowledge that they hoped would light the way to a safer future. That hope was perhaps naive, but it was genuine, and it sustained them through these uncertain days. The search for a self-sustaining chain reaction was not a sprint. It was a patient, methodical unfolding. Fermi had moved to the University of Chicago in early 1942, joining the newly formed metallurgical laboratory. The name was deliberately misleading, a peaceful, almost quaint term that masked the gravity of the work. Chicago was a city of broad avenues and cold winds off Lake Michigan, but the laboratory was tucked away in the university's Gothic buildings, their ivy-covered stone walls offering a sense of permanence. In an office with a high window overlooking a quiet courtyard, Fermi set up his chalkboard and began to sketch the architecture of the unknown. His work habits remained the same as they had been in Rome, long periods of contemplation broken by sudden bursts of brisk calculation. Every morning, he would walk from his family's apartment near the lake, cutting through the campus with its oak trees and manicured lawns. The summer light was soft and golden, slanting through the leaves. He often paused by the botany pond, where ducks bobbed peacefully, to order his thoughts. The problem was not just theory. To build a reactor, he needed materials of extraordinary purity, graphite bricks, uranium metal and oxide, in quantities that had never been produced before. The coordination of industrial supply and academic physics was a new kind of challenge, one that Fermi approached with his characteristic calm. The team gathered in a cramped laboratory space to run what they called exponential experiments, smaller piles of graphite and uranium that tested how neutrons behaved without reaching criticality. The rooms were unglamorous, filled with the gray dust of graphite, the air hot and stuffy. Scientists dressed in ordinary work clothes, their hands stained black, moved like monks in a curious monastery. Fermi stood at the center, stopwatch in hand, counting the clicks of a neutron counter. His voice was low, instructing students to add one more brick, then another. Each small pile brought them closer to understanding the optimal arrangement for a full-scale reactor. There was no applause, only the quiet satisfaction of a problem half solved. Autumn arrived, and with it a sense of urgency. The war demanded results, but the laboratory remained a bubble of focused tranquility. The leaves outside turned crimson and gold, and they crunched underfoot as Fermi walked to work in the cool, crisp air. The site chosen for the final reactor was unexpected, a double squash court beneath the west stands of Stagg Field, the university's abandoned football stadium. The space was cramped and dusty, with low ceilings and walls of bare concrete. To outsiders, it seemed an unlikely birthplace for the atomic age. But Fermi appreciated its obscurity and its sturdy structure. The squash court became their new sanctuary, a place where light glowed not from windows, but from bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The construction of Chicago Pile 1 began in November 1942. Layer by layer, the graphite bricks were stacked, alternating with cubes of uranium embedded in the graphite matrix. Cadmium control rods, hung from the ceiling on ropes, would absorb neutrons and keep the reaction in check until they were carefully withdrawn. The work was physical. Young physicists and hired laborers hauled heavy materials, their breath misting in the unheated space. Fermi was often among them, laying bricks with his own hands, his shirt sleeves rolled up. The scene had a curious dignity, not a factory, not a sterile lab, but a collaborative human effort, much like the raising of an ancient barn. The talk was sparse, the focus absolute. There was a rhythm to the days. In the morning, Fermi would review the data from the previous day's stacking. At noon, he would eat a simple sandwich while walking around the campus, the Gothic spires piercing the gray sky. In the afternoon, he returned to the squash court, where the pile grew steadily, a dark tower of man-made stone. The only sounds were the soft thud of graphite blocks settling into place, the scrape of wooden scaffolding, and the distant chords of a janitor's radio from the corridor. It was a time suspended between peace and fire, a slow dance of preparation. On the last day of November, the pile stood 20 layers high, a silent monument to human ingenuity, and Fermi calculated that they were nearly ready. The morning of December 2nd, 1942, broke cold and gray over Chicago. A light snow had fallen during the night, dusting the rooftops and softening the edges of the university buildings. Fermi walked to the squash court earlier than usual, his coat collar turned up against the wind off the lake. Inside, the pile was complete, a massive, dark lattice of graphite and uranium, 57 layers high, filling the space like a slumbering beast. The cadmium control rods, sheathed in their protective casings, rested deep within its core, holding everything in a state of patient stillness. A small team of scientists had gathered, their breath visible in the chill air. There was no sense of spectacle, only the quiet expectation of a long-rehearsed performance. On the balcony of the squash court, Fermi set up a small command post, a table, a chair, a slide rule, and a notebook. He looked over the railing at the pile below, his expression calm and unreadable. The safety rod, named Zip, was held by a rope and a wooden wedge. If anything went wrong, the wedge could be knocked aside and the rod would drop back into place, absorbing the neutrons and shutting the whole thing down. Another rod, controlled by a winch, would be withdrawn slowly according to Fermi's instructions. The counter clicked steadily in the background, its sound like a soft, persistent heartbeat. Each click counted a neutron, a tiny messenger from the hidden world. Fermi began the experiment with the same methodical care he had used in his childhood experiments at the market stall. He ordered the first rod withdrawn in measured steps. After each step, he studied the counter, jotted a number, and compared it to his predictions. The clicks increased, as expected. The graphite reflected the neutrons, the uranium gave birth to more. Still, the pile was subcritical, a forced drip, not a cascade. He called out the next measurement, then the next, his voice even and unhurried. The small crowd on the balcony, scientists, a few administrators, watched in near total silence. The only sounds were the clicking of the counter, the hum of a fan, and the distant whistle of a train. The morning wore on. At one point, Fermi announced they would break for lunch. It was a surprisingly human moment, a reminder that even at the threshold of a new age, hunger and rest had their proper place. The group dispersed to the faculty club, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee under the gilded ceiling of Hutchinson Commons. They spoke of everyday things, of families and weather, carefully avoiding the magnitude of what they were about to accomplish. Fermi ate his lunch in his usual unhurried way, then wiped his hands and walked back outside. The snow had stopped. The campus was very still under the low white sky, the trees bare and dark, the world holding its breath. When they reassembled at the squash court, The atmosphere had subtly shifted. The tension was not dramatic, it was the attentive quiet of a chapel. Fermi called for the rod to be withdrawn further. The counter's clicks quickened, merging into a rapid chatter. Then, as the final centimeters were removed, the sound changed. It became a continuous, rushing noise, like rain on a tin roof. The needles on the instruments swung to their limits, their measured arcs no longer adequate. This was the chain reaction, sustaining itself. A faint warmth began to emanate from the pile, a ghost of the immense power now flowing just beyond the visible. Fermi raised his hand, a small gesture, and said simply, "The reaction is self-sustaining." It was a statement of fact, delivered without fanfare. For 28 minutes, they let the reactor run, monitoring the gentle rise in temperature and the steady flux of neutrons. The power level was minuscule, half a watt, barely enough to light a small bulb, but it was a seed of infinite possibility. Fermi stood at the railing, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the instruments, watching the curve he had predicted unfold with sublime precision. There were no photographs of the moment, no journalists. Only a secret log entry and a bottle of Chianti quietly passed around. The wine was poured into paper cups, a silent toast amid the graphite dust. Then, at Fermi's command, the rod was reinserted. The counter slowed, the rushing sound faded, and the pile fell asleep once more, exactly as planned. As evening fell, the team drifted out of the squash court into the winter dusk. The campus lights came on one by one, their yellow glow reflecting in the patches of snow. Fermi walked home alone, his footsteps crunching softly on the frozen path. He carried no trophy, only the knowledge that humanity had entered a new era. The city of Chicago spread around him, its streets peaceful under a blanket of white, its families gathering for supper, unaware that the atom had been tamed in their midst. It was a moment of profound serenity, the quiet after a long and patient labor. The stars began to appear, cold and clear above the lake, and the world turned gently toward an uncertain but luminous tomorrow. The years that followed Chicago Pile, one were a whirlwind of change, but Fermi himself remained anchored in a quiet center. He spent time at Los Alamos, that secret city on the high mesa of New Mexico, where the air was thin and clear and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains glowed pink at dawn. There, in the Spartan laboratories surrounded by pines and desert brush, he contributed to the vast collective effort of the Manhattan Project. Yet, even amidst that urgency, his daily rhythms stayed gentle. He would rise early, walk among the ponderosa pines, his footsteps muffled by a carpet of needles, watching the hummingbirds dart between scarlet flowers. The desert light was pure and sharp, a world away from the soft gold of Rome, but it offered its own kind of peace. At Los Alamos, Fermi's presence was like a tuning fork. Other scientists, some famous, some unknown, sought him out to test their ideas. His office door was always open, and the sound of his low, patient voice became a familiar comfort in a place of extraordinary tension. He never raised his tone, never hurried. If a question was difficult, he would lean back in his chair, gaze out the window at the Jemez Mountains, and think in silence for a few moments. Then the answer would come, clear and complete, as if he were reading from an invisible text. In the evenings, he would sometimes play tennis on a dusty court, the ball's rhythmic thud blending with the sound of wind in the junipers. After the war ended, Fermi returned to Chicago, to the university that had given his greatest experiment a home. The city had changed, the war was over, the atomic age had arrived, but the campus remained a sanctuary. He became a beloved professor, teaching a new generation of physicists in the same calm style he had always used. His lectures were models of clarity, delivered without notes, each equation unfolding like a narrative. Students would fill the lecture hall, the wooden seats creaking gently, and listen to him explain the most complex ideas with the simplicity of a man explaining how to bake bread. The sun would stream through the high windows, illuminating chalk dust floating in the air. In 1949, Fermi turned his attention to a new mystery, the origin of cosmic rays. The problem was suited to his temperament, vast, ancient, requiring both deep physics and a sense of wonder. He proposed that these high-energy particles, which rain down on Earth from every direction, are accelerated by magnetic fields in interstellar space. The quiet beauty of this idea was typical of him. The cosmos became a gentle accelerator, a vast laboratory not unlike the one on Via Panisperna. He would sketch the theories on the blackboard of his Chicago office, the same board that had once held the equations for the reactor. The chalk made soft white lines under his hand, and outside the window, the trees of the quadrangle changed with the seasons. The 1950s brought honors and travels, but Fermi's life remained centered on family and science. At home in the Hyde Park neighborhood, he tended a small garden. In the summer evenings, he would sit on the porch with Laura, watching the fireflies blink in the twilight. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with the sounds of children playing and the distant hum of the city. He had grown fond of the Great Lakes and once took a long sailing trip on Lake Michigan, the boat cutting gently through the water under a sky of soft summer stars. He spoke little of the past, of Rome or Stockholm or the squash court, but those who knew him saw a contentment in his stillness, a man at peace with the path he had walked. In the autumn of 1954, Enrico Fermi fell ill. The diagnosis was stomach cancer, and it progressed quickly. He faced his final months with the same quiet acceptance he had brought to every challenge. He continued to work when strength allowed, sitting in a sunlit room at home, papers spread around him. Colleagues visited, speaking in low voices, and he listened more than he talked. The light through the windows took on the golden hue of a dying year. On the 28th of November, he told his wife that the end was near. A priest came, an old friend, and they spoke softly in the afternoon stillness. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall over Chicago, covering the streets and the campus and the place where the pile had once stood, a quiet blanket of white. Enrico Fermi died on November 28, 1954, at the age of 53. The world marked his passing with words of grandeur, but those who loved him remembered the small things, his gentle smile, his unshakable calm, his habit of pausing to watch a bird or a cloud before answering a question. His legacy is not written in thunder, but in the steady light of understanding. Walk through the University of Chicago today, past the bronze sculpture that marks the site of the first reactor, and you will feel no roar of energy, only the whisper of wind through the oak trees, the splash of a fountain. The quiet footsteps of students on the path. That is Fermi's true monument, not the power he unleashed, but the peace with which he pursued the truth. As the sun sets over the lake, casting a long gold path on the water, you can almost hear his voice in the hush of the evening, calm and clear, inviting the world to rest.